This is Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Joining me from Mulrennan Middle School is John Watson, who serves as the Social Studies Subject Area Leader at that school. Today we're going to talk about how the media, individual people, and interest groups all play a role in influencing and monitoring the government. John, thank you so much for joining me today. What's your first question?
Thank you. What role does and or should media play in the political process?
That's a great question. We know that the media are protected in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. There's freedom of the press. But then the question comes up about what role should they play? Because, of course, we want the media to be there, to be our eyes and ears when we're busy doing something else. But at the same time, many people have looked at the media as playing one of several roles, some of which are friendlier to government and some are less friendly to government. In the last 30 or 40 years, probably since the 1960s, we have seen the media play the role of a watchdog, meaning that the media are there to make sure that government is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And at the same time, the government has been, not behaving well all of the time.
Right.
This concept of a watchdog role became very important, particularly after Watergate, and it was two journalists who discovered and opened up the whole Watergate scandal that led to the resignation, the one-time resignation of any president, Richard Nixon. But some people also say that the role of the media is of setting the agenda. And by setting the agenda, what that means is the media decides what's important. By what they report on, it becomes what's important, it becomes what people talk about, and because it's what people are talking about, then the expectation is that government will respond. So those are two very different roles, right? Watchdog, agenda setter, okay? Some people say that the media also acts as a filter or a framing process, that the way that we see issues is framed by the media, what are the important aspects of those issues. And then we also, of course, see that the media play a role in terms of how we conduct elections in this country, right? That the media play a very, very important role in terms of what we learn about candidates and how we learn about them, either through press coverage of candidates or by setting the rates and setting the parameters for campaign advertising.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense and everything. And traditionally speaking, they could set the agenda, but how do you see new media like the internet? What role is that playing? Because now you have people who are entering the conversation without having to be on a television or having to be any other place but their living room.
Right. Many people have said that the internet has really democratized American politics because now people have the opportunity to have their voice heard, which they always had, but it's so much easier now than it ever was. We have people who keep blogs, for example, or a web log, or what we call a blog. And people sort of, they do their own watchdogging and they post articles and they write articles and then people read each other's blogs and so forth. We also have people playing more frequent and high-frequency roles in campaigns. Imagine looking at these social networking sites and how just by joining a social networking site, people can get a hold of you and ask you for money or give you information about a campaign or a candidate or where a candidate's going to be holding an event, if it's going to be an online event or an in-person event. And so there's all kinds of ways that these very advanced technologies through the media, on the internet and through social media, that they've really changed sort of the nature of civic engagement, that people can get much more involved civically because of the internet. So it's an interesting irony too, John, right? Because indeed, people say that by having access to the internet, people can just be home isolating themselves from the rest of the world, and yet it's their entry point to the rest of the world as well now.
And that's quite interesting too, being able to access the world right there at your fingertips and so forth. So with all this media out there and it's playing a role, do you feel that it's been playing a positive role or a negative role when it comes to the political process?
I would have to say both positive and negative. Right? How is it bad that I am informed? Right. Okay? How is it bad that any citizen is informed? However, what some people are concerned about is the negatives associated with being informed in a way that might be biased toward a specific point of view.
Right.
Such as, for example, if we were to portray that every person in prison today was illiterate and uneducated, when we know that's not true.
Right.
If we were to portray that persons who are receiving welfare benefits are of certain race and gender groups only, and age groups only,
Right.
then we're going to have different opinions about the next step that government should take as a result of that biased framing.
Right.
At the same time, we also see, in my view, that it's very expensive to utilize the media for civic engagement, such as through campaigns. And so what many people argue is that because campaign commercials cost so much money, that they're shorter.
Right.
And the shorter a commercial is, the less information you can sort of stuff in there. And so today, for example, we found that, that campaign commercials are on average 30 to 60 seconds long. It used to be that when a president was speaking at a press conference or some other event, that the president would speak for a period of time, and then the amount that would be rebroadcast on the evening news of a snippet of a speech might be as long as 30 seconds or 30 to 40 seconds. And that's what we call the sound bite. Okay? Now the average sound bite is less than 9 seconds. So how much information, how much can the president transmit his message, or a member of Congress transmit his or her message, if they know that the amount that's going to be rebroadcast of that message is 8 to 9 seconds? So what does that result in? What that results in is these campaign slogans that are completely uninformed. What does hope mean? What does change mean?
Right.
What does America First mean?
Right.
But it costs so much money to produce the commercials that we have less and less information going into them, less and less information being broadcast as news, and then the consequences are a less informed electorate. So those are some of the negatives that people talk about.
I can see that so clearly right there. And to me, what it does is makes the person have to become literate, media literate, if you will, and have to learn that that's the case. So I have to do my own research, my own digging, and so forth, which leads to my next question. There's truth, and then there's perception. Okay, now, because people receive their information from the media and from these sound bites and so forth, is there any type of responsibility that media should have to maintain truth? I mean, is there any type of responsibility that we should hold them accountable to make sure that what they're reporting and what they're putting out there is based in some truth?
John, we started this conversation talking about the First Amendment, and we talked about the idea that the Congress cannot abridge the freedom of the press. But let's be clear that the press, their freedoms are abridged all the time, okay? There are laws that limit freedom of the press so that a person cannot be lied about, a person cannot be written about in a way that is libelous or slanderous, that a person cannot be spoken of in a way that is a lie about them. At the same time, we also used to have a federal law in place that no longer is, and it's called the Fairness Doctrine. In 1934, think about it, before television, we have Congress passed something called the Federal Communications Act. The Federal Communications Act, Section 315, includes various components relating to news coverage of campaigns, the purchasing of media time for campaigning, and how news items are presented. What the law says is that there shall be an equal time given to candidates seeking the same office. That's called the equal time provision. And that's been sort of interpreted to mean equal time to those candidates who really have a chance at winning. Right? We could have 10 people running for president, but they don't get equal time. But the nature of the coverage doesn't have to be equal. It can be very positive coverage for some, perhaps emphasis on a scandal for another, but it's equal time. When it comes to buying media time for commercials, that the lowest rate for that time slot has to be charged to every candidate. So that means no candidate can be advantaged because they have a friend on the editorial board, or the friend who's the editor, or the CEO of the media company, and so the person's opponents get charged an awful lot of money. But the one that used to be in the law that no longer is something called the Fairness Doctrine. That was taken away in the mid-1980s under President Reagan. And basically the Fairness Doctrine said that alternative points of view for news stories, for explaining events, had to be explored. So there had to be an alternative point of view explored. Why did something happen? Did it happen for this reason, or let's explore other possibilities? So the Fairness Doctrine is no more. And some people say that as a consequence of this Fairness Doctrine going away, there has been sort of this growth of biased news shows and biased media in terms of radio, TV talk shows, radio talk shows, that people say, well, it's so biased, how can it be the media? Well, because federal law essentially used to give less freedom to the press because of the Fairness Doctrine, and now there's more freedom to be what many people say is biased, for example.
Okay, then since the government was actually involved with controlling it and making sure everything's equal, should the market maybe play a role naturally speaking? And what I mean by that is, since you have so many different voices out there, talk radio is so big now, should we just naturally let the people, the citizens, decide?
Well, sure. I mean, the citizens can have their own internet radio shows, for example. And certainly there's all kinds of opportunities for citizens to have a voice. But, you know, it's interesting. This is sort of, you know, which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? Do we have negative talk radio today and negative TV shows that are very negative against government? Or do we have other kinds of negative campaign ads? Do we have those things because the industry created them, or because the public demands them? Right. These are highly rated shows. Some of the most highly paid media personalities are on these very shows that we say negative things about the government. They're not very well informed. But these are the best paid people. These are the highest rated shows. So the public in many respects demands it, which from my own perspective, I truly believe that if we were better civically literate from elementary school on, we wouldn't tolerate some of the kinds of things that we hear on the radio, and those folks would be the least paid people in the media and not the best.
Right, I see, and I understand that. That makes perfect sense. So civic engagement, civic education, people being able to decipher between the information that's being given to them, because there's so much information being given.
And people knowing what questions to ask and wanting to ask them.
Right. And for me personally, I look at the person who's running for office, and having access to those persons many times is very limited. So it would be nice to be able to access those persons. So you're watching someone being interviewed for a position, and you're like, they're not asking the right question. You know, they're not asking the right question. Do you think there should be more access between the public and the public officials running for office?
You know, I've spoken to some public officials who've said that sort of the middle ground between news coverage, which the candidate has no control over, and campaign commercials, which the candidate has full control over, of course within limitations, that there needs to be a middle ground, and that middle ground is debates. And so we've seen people that are looking at the media as an opportunity to give them that information, but to structure a debate so that someone who is neutral is asking really hard questions, and the person is right there on live television having to answer them. Right? So as people say that the media serves a very positive role for civic literacy, particularly during campaigns, the more and more debates that there are. But of course, the candidates have to agree to those debates as well.
And they choose not to do that if they can avoid it.
Right, and many times the incumbent will choose not to do that because that person has a record that could be called out in a debate. John, it's been such a pleasure talking to you today about this very interesting subject. We've been talking about how the media, individual people, and other groups and entities play a role in monitoring and influencing the government. That's Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine.